They came like shadows before dawn, men with torches, swords, and greed in their eyes. Villages that had known only the sound of the sea and the rhythm of drums suddenly echoed with screams. Fires consumed huts. Children cried for their mothers, and the night sky turned red. Bound by ropes, hundreds were forced toward the coast. Men strong enough to lift, women young enough to bear, and children just old enough to obey. Among them was one man, Amari, a fisherman from the shores of Kilwa, whose life was about to be erased and rewritten in chains. They told him he was cargo now, that his worth will be measured not by his name, but by the strength of his back. But deep within his heart, Amari swore silently, "You can chain my hands, but not my spirit." The year was 869 C. The Indian Ocean slave trade had reached its peak, and East African captives were being shipped across the sea to foreign lands. Arabia, Persia, and the distant cities of the Abbasid Caliphate. Amari's journey began in the hold of a wooden dhow, packed so tightly that he could barely breathe. The air reeked of salt, sweat, and despair. Days turned into weeks as the ship crossed the sea. Some captives didn't survive the voyage. Their bodies tossed into the waves, swallowed by the same ocean they had once fished for food. When the ship finally reached Basra, in southern Mesopotamia, the survivors were sold like animals. The buyers were rich landowners seeking laborers to clear salt marshes and build canals for the empire's vast plantations. Amari and thousands of others were driven into the marshlands, the most brutal place on earth. The mud burned their feet, the salt ate into their wounds, and the heat blistered their skin. From dawn until nightfall, they dug ditches, drained swamps, and carried heavy baskets of earth, while overseers watched with whips in hand. "Work faster, slave," one guard shouted. Amari didn't reply. His body moved, but his mind was awake, memorizing faces, counting guards, and marking the patterns of patrols. He was quiet, but he was learning. At night, the slaves held together in makeshift huts made of palm leaves and scraps of cloth. They spoke in whispers about home, about lost families, and about freedom. Among them, Amari's calm voice began to stand out. "If they think we are beasts," he said one night, "then let us remind them that even beasts will bite when cornered." But for now, he hid his fire. He worked, observed, and waited. The guards thought him obedient, but inside his anger was building like a storm. He saw a woman, Asha, dragged away for speaking back to a foreman. He saw an old man collapse under the sun and left to die in the mud. Each injustice carved another wound in his heart, until one day, Amari whispered to his closest friend, "This cannot be forever. Not for us. Not for our children." The night was silent. The marshes shimmered under the moonlight. Amari lay awake, staring at the stars, the same stars that had watched over him in Africa. From somewhere deep in the labor camps, a faint cry rose, not of pain, but defiance. A guard shouted. A whip cracked. Then silence. Amari's eyes narrowed. The spark had been lit, and he knew the river that carried their pain would soon carry their vengeance. The air was thick with heat and fear. The marshes hissed like serpents under the sun. Thousands of enslaved men worked in silence, their backs bleeding, their chains clinking with each step. But beneath that silence, something dangerous was growing. The guards thought it was exhaustion. The overseers thought it was submission. But it wasn't. It was anger. It was memory. It was the sound of men who had suffered enough. And soon, those marshes would no longer echo with chains, but with the roar of rebellion. By 869 CE, the salt marshes of southern Mesopotamia had become a graveyard of dreams. Thousands of Zanj slaves, stolen from East Africa, labored under unbearable conditions. But among them, Amari had become a quiet leader, a man who spoke with reason and inspired hope where there was none. He began gathering others during the night, men broken by labor, women beaten for defiance, even a few Arab peasants who shared their pain. "We are many," Amari whispered. "They are few. The day will come when these chains no longer hold us, but help us fight." They started with small acts of resistance. Buckets of salt spilled accidentally. Bridges collapsed at midnight. Food stores were poisoned to weaken the guards. Whispers spread like wind. The word freedom carried from one labor camp to another. But one night, everything changed. A young man named Keto was caught stealing a blade. The guards dragged him before the others and lashed him until his back was a canvas of blood. Amari stood among the crowd, fists clenched. "Let this be a lesson," the guard shouted. But Amari didn't lower his gaze. He met the guard's eyes and said softly, "You will regret this." That night, the camp burned. It began with one torch, thrown into a storehouse soaked with oil. Then came the screams, the fire, the chaos. Slaves broke their chains, stormed the armory, and seized weapons. For the first time in decades, the enslaved struck back. The rebellion had begun. From the marshes to the city of Basra, thousands joined. Camps of resistance were formed, led by Amari, who was now called the Lion of the Zanj. They built barricades, crafted makeshift swords, and raided caravans carrying supplies to the Abbasid army. "They made us build canals," Amari said, "and now we use those same waters to drown their tyranny." The Abbasid Caliphate was shaken, a mighty empire, challenged by slaves it once ignored. Armies were sent, but the Zanj were united, fighting with desperation and fury. Villages were freed, plantations burned, and for a brief, breathtaking moment, it seemed as though the Zanj might actually win. But as the rebellion spread, so did fear and vengeance. The caliph's forces began their retaliation, burning entire towns believed to aid the rebels. Men, women, and children punished without mercy. Amari stood over the ruins of a captured garrison, looking at the flames rise. Keto, his once enslaved friend, stood beside him and asked, "Was it worth it, Amari?" Amari's voice was steady but heavy. "Freedom is never won without blood. But tell me, Keto, whose blood must it be?" The rebellion had awakened hope, but it also awakened something darker, revenge in the price of freedom. The wind carried the scent of fire and death. In the distance, the drums of the Abbasid army thundered, thousands of soldiers marching toward the marshes. Amari stood tall on the riverbank, gripping his blood-stained sword. He knew what was coming, the Empire's full wrath. "If this river must run red," he whispered, "then let it carry the story of our freedom." The torches of the Caliph's army glimmered on the horizon, like stars descending from the sky. The final battle was near. The sky was heavy with smoke and ash. The rivers that once glimmered silver under the moonlight now carried the color of blood. The rebellion that began as a whisper had become a storm, and now that storm was collapsing under its own fury. The Empire had returned, stronger, ruthless, determined to erase every trace of defiance. The Zanj had no allies, no reinforcements, no retreat. But they had one thing left, a burning desire to die free. This was the final stand of Amari, the Lion of the Zanj. The year was 883 CE. 14 years since the first spark of rebellion. The Zanj uprising had grown into one of the largest slave revolts in history, spreading across southern Iraq and shaking the Abbasid Caliphate to its core. But now the end was near. The Empire's army surrounded the last Zanj stronghold, a swamp fortress carved from mud and hope. Inside, thousands of survivors huddled, weary and hungry. Among them stood Amari, his hair gray by years of war, his eyes burning with the same fire that had started it all. He looked upon his people. Farmers turned soldiers, mothers turned nurses, children who had never known a life without the sound of battle. We built this land with our blood, Amari told them. And if this is where we fall, then let the earth remember our names. The attack began at dawn. Siege engines hurled fire into marshes, turning water to steam and soil to ash. The air filled with arrows. Still, the Zanj fought, men and women side by side, driven by nothing but the will to live free. For days, the battle raged. Every inch of ground was bought with lives. The rebels were outnumbered, outarmed, but not out of spirit. Amari led from the front, sword in hand, mud on his face, shouting words that would echo through history. We were slaves in their world, but here, in this fire, we are kings. But courage could not stop the inevitable. The Abbasid army broke through the final line of defense. Quito fell first, struck by an arrow while shielding a child. Asha, the woman who had once been beaten for defiance, refused to flee. She fought with a spear until her last breath. Amari watched as his people fell one after another. Yet even as defeat closed in, he did not kneel, wounded and bleeding. He staggered to the edge of the river, the same marshes that had once enslaved them all. "You can kill me," he whispered to the soldiers surrounding him, "but you cannot kill what we become." They struck him down, but the legend did not die. When the battle ended, the Abbasid banners rose over a land of ashes. But from the ruins came stories, tales carried by travelers and freedmen, of the Zanj who defied an empire, of Amari, the lion who roared in chains, and of a rebellion that refused to be forgotten. The rivers of Basra still flow, silent witnesses to the war that once turned them red. The empire that crushed the Zanj is long gone, but the memory of their courage remains eternal. Amari's body was lost in marshes, but his spirit became a whisper in the wind, a voice that calls out across generations. Rise. Even when they chain you, rise. This was not just a story of a rebellion. It was a story of humanity's oldest cry, freedom. Because history does not remember the comfort kings. It remembers the courage of slaves who chose to fight. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Click subscribe to join us on Tales by Das, where the untold stories of pain, courage, and history come alive once more. And if you want to see more stories like this, hit that bell, share this story, and let their voices live again.